Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. We're here to talk about one of my favorite lecture topics. We're going to build hypotheses. This is awesome. It's exciting, trust me. Hypotheses are fun. In fact, it's one of the things that I really love about sociology is trying to think about the relationships between two variables or two ideas and guessing what happens. Now, with sociology, going back in time, sociologists are always trying to guess what happens in the future. We're a rare field that tries to predict what will happen. And hypotheses are kind of part of that. We were thinking that, if one social phenomenon changed, like people became more educated, then we expected some particular thing would correlate with that. It was a hypothesis building process that we were going through. Now, what I want to do is talk about hypotheses, something that we briefly defined early in our lecture series several lectures ago. And then I told you that we're going to come back to it, and now we're coming back to it. And I want to go through the process of looking at what isn't a hypothesis, and then I want to look at fixing those what isn't a hypothesis examples, and also look at what good hypotheses are trying to do. We're also going to introduce a couple of other basic ideas to round out our lecture on hypotheses. Do you remember one of the things that comes out of this class, an outcome that we measure in this class, is that at the end of the semester, you'll be able to write a hypothesis. And I promise you, today is not the first time that we'll get to practice this. We're going to practice this many, many times before the semester is over. In fact, you'll be practicing this very specific thing in one of your assignments, writing a hypothesis for the very first time. All right, let's give some examples of what a hypothesis is. Now, first off, a hypothesis is a statement describing what we will expect of a relationship between two variables. Remember the phrase correlation? We think there's a correlation between this variable and that variable. And as we change the first one, then some kind of change will correlate in the second one. Here's some examples of quantitative sociological hypotheses. Our first one would be dealing with educational attainment and health insurance. I hypothesize, you could start all of these with the phrase, I hypothesize that Kentucky counties with higher educational attainment will have improved access to health care insurance when compared to counties with lower educational attainment. Now, I want to point out some components of this. First off, you should be able to start all of your hypotheses with the phrase, I hypothesize, because if you do that, you're less likely to make it into a question. We'll look at that issue in a moment on our next slide. So you can start with the idea, I hypothesize. And by saying you hypothesize, you're saying that based on all this existing literature and based on the evidence that's been collected by other people, not you, but by other people, unless you're a famous researcher and you've already collected data on it, and then you could base on your own research, but you're not there yet. I am. I wouldn't say I'm a famous researcher, but anyways, we can edit that out. Can we edit that out? Yep, good. Okay, we'll edit that out. With hypotheses, we could start them by saying, I hypothesize, and then we're making a statement of fact. And what we're going to do in this statement of fact is we're going to state a relationship. So in this example, Kentucky counties with higher educational attainment will have improved access to health insurance. Now that's my statement of fact. Now notice what happens in the last half of this when compared to counties with lower educational attainment. So what I'm doing is making a statement of fact, and then I'm following it with a comparison. So I'm saying counties with higher educational attainment are going to have improved access to health care compared to counties with lower educational attainment. I've stated a correlation between those. I hypothesize, I've made a statement of fact, and I've made a comparison. That's a hypothesis. That's a good hypothesis. Couple of other examples. States with greater investments in education will have higher life expectancies when compared to states with lower investments in education. I hypothesize states with greater investments in education will have higher life expectancies, statement of fact, and now our comparison when compared to states with lower investments in education. That's a hypothesis. Communities with less social cohesion will have higher rates of outmigration. We could continue the rest of that statement there too by saying, when compared to those who have lower outmigration. Likewise, Gen Z persons select occupations using different criteria than Gen X persons. These are all hypotheses. We make sure that they are statements of facts. Now, those first two are our best. Those are the better ones. Those last two, they could be qualitative, quantitative ones. So maybe we don't know exactly how we want to compare those just yet. But as we get into them, we could probably clarify those hypotheses by adding in that comparison near the end. But that's a hypothesis. We still have good hypotheses here. Let's look at what isn't a hypothesis. The most classic example I get, hypothesis 1, why do rock climbers come to Kentucky? Folks, that's what we call a question, not a hypothesis. We'll fix it in a moment, but that is a question. Do you see how it has a question mark at the end? Yeah, you see that at the end, right? It's beside the word Kentucky. Do you see it? That's a question. Trust me on that. Not a hypothesis. Is it a statement of fact? No, it's a question. Why do rock climbers come to Kentucky? Another example, rock climbers will be highly educated. It's a statement of fact, but it doesn't really have any comparison to it. This is especially where we need a little more information. Rock climbers will be highly educated compared to what? Likewise, too, what's the relationship here? It's not rock climbers, it's this group is educated compared differently to some other group. We need more information. Climbers will come to Kentucky, also not a hypothesis. Now we could fill that out and make that into a hypothesis, but it's just a statement right now. Now let's look at how we might fix these. Let's start with that Kentucky one. Why do rock climbers come to Kentucky? Not a hypothesis. Better example, climbers with high place attachment to a particular location, like Kentucky, will visit there more often when compared to areas with lower place attachment. I hypothesize, statement of fact, and a comparison. And now I've taken your why do rock climbers come to Kentucky and tried to do something that we can test as a hypothesis. In fact, the reason is that they have a really strong sense of particular place attachment to this location, and it brings them here. They want to be in this area because they have strong ties to it. So now we can test that in a hypothesis. Rock climbers will be highly educated, not a hypothesis. But we could say that climbers have higher educational attainment on average when compared to paddlers. We're kind of making a comparison between two groups here. Or maybe a better sociological example would be that climbers place a higher value on telecommuting than paddlers on average and are, as a result, more likely to be highly educated on average than paddlers. Whew. That's a dense one, but nonetheless, you could write a book on that, and it's a sociological hypothesis. Climbers will come to Kentucky, not a hypothesis. Better example of that, climbers who place a high importance on sport climbing will have a higher visitation rate to Kentucky than those who don't. That's a hypothesis. Now note that some of these have the word soc example beside them. Some of these aren't really sociological questions, like climbers have higher educational attainment on average when compared to paddlers. It's an interesting question to me, but it's not really a sociological question. Some of these are just plain old research questions that aren't sociological. Nonetheless, we've fixed them all to make good hypotheses. Now, when you're thinking about hypotheses, I want you to start thinking about relationships. And when you think about relationships and correlations between those relationship that you're studying, I want you to think about independent variables. Now, an independent variable is the one that happens first. An independent variable is a variable that when it changes, we hypothesize that it will create change in a different variable. So the idea is that let's pretend I'm studying educational attainment. And I think that as I increase educational attainment, as people in an area get smarter and more education, that will change some other variable. That other variable that I'm talking about is what we call a dependent variable. Now, a dependent variable is a variable that we think will be changed when we change another variable. Now, one thing to remember is we always want to make sure that the independent variable would happen first. So I can't make the argument that the educational attainment of people in 2010 will influence higher incomes in the year 2000. Why? Well, year 2000 is way over here off camera, and the year 2010 is way ahead of it. We have to make sure we keep them in order. I think that higher educational attainment in 2010 will influence having higher incomes in 2011. Happens first, happens second. This one changes, this one gets changed by this one. That's our hypothesis. I hypothesize that as we increase educational attainment, we will see higher incomes overall in counties with higher educational attainment. Let's try that again. I hypothesize that as we increase educational attainment in Kentucky counties, that we will see higher incomes. As this one goes up, this one goes up. Always remember that the independent happens first. Now, one thing I will say is that when you get more advanced in statistical analysis, you can have multiple independent variables in your hypotheses, and they can all shape this one. But there's always going to just be this one dependent variable over here. You're not going to have multiple dependent variables. It's always just one of these here. So we can have 5 different variables in a hypothesis influence this dependent variable, but there's always going to be one of this. You can have 5 of these if you want, but you're always going to have one. What is far, far better is to have one over here, because you can have multiple hypotheses and look at other relationships and different kinds of relationships further down, but keep your hypotheses nice and simple. We'll talk more about independent and dependent variables a lot as we start conducting basic research and learning about that. Try to get this in mind now. One thing that I find is really helpful is to remember that with independent variable, it comes first, and that the dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. So the independent variable is free to change however it wants, but that the dependent variable is somehow hinging on this one to be able to change. Find other ways to memorize it too that might work for you. You can tattoo it on your arm. Okay, maybe not that. And we'll talk about a couple of other tricks that I use when we start talking about secondary data analysis as well. We'll revisit this idea later in the lectures series. But we've got this idea of hypotheses, right? Now we're testing relationships. We're looking at correlations between independent variables and the dependent variable. Couple of other things, and this is an exciting one. You may not have known this. You've been building hypotheses probably for other classes, or maybe even from when you were in high school science fairs and things like that. We're going to get in the practice of developing null hypotheses as well. And really what happens when we develop a hypothesis is we're developing 2 hypotheses. We're developing a hypothesis that we state, and then behind it we're stating a null hypothesis. Now, a good example of a regular old hypothesis is residents in counties with higher educational attainment have higher access to health insurance compared to counties with lower educational attainment. Let's look at this. Our independent variable here would be higher educational attainment, and we think as this goes up, then health insurance, our dependent, will also improve, right? That's kind of cool. Our null hypothesis is that there's no difference in health insurance access in counties based on differences in educational attainment. So our null hypothesis is that the dependent does not change because the independent changes. The cool thing is that we're not really proving our hypotheses. You're going to come to find out, particularly as we work with secondary data, is that we are always trying to reject the null hypothesis. In fact, we will have a statistical formula for being able to say we reject with 95% or greater certainty that the null hypothesis is true, and therefore we can only accept the hypothesis. Now, what I want you to get in a process of as you practice writing hypotheses is always write a hypothesis with an independent and a dependent variable, and then behind it a null hypothesis where the independent variable has no relationship to the dependent variable. It's often just as simple as saying that there's no difference in the dependent variable based on the independent variable. These are basic ideas, but we're going to bring them up many, many times, and don't worry, you're going to have a chance to practice them as well. A couple more things that I want to introduce, and this is really mostly just reminding you. As we work on hypotheses, we have to remember that they serve a purpose in the scientific method. Now, in our class and in 470 as well, we are adhering to the scientific method. We're going through the process. Research follows a specific process in the scientific method. We identify a topic, we frame it as a question, we look at what other people have said about it, something we call a literature review. And then we, based on that literature and what we think will happen, we set up a hypothesis or multiple hypotheses, if there's more than one. Based on the literature, based on what others have said, we examine data. Sometimes we collect that data, sometimes other people do, but we examine data in an effort to reject our null hypothesis. And then after analyzing that data, we go through the process of discussing what it means and what we suggest to future researchers. Now, understand that for the 470 class, you'll go through that full process. For us, we're only walking through those first couple of steps. We're going to go through the process of identifying a topic. I'm going to provide some of the literature for you or some of the ideas, or we just simply will make assumptions about them because we're just really focusing on the research process, not writing literature reviews, which are summaries of what other people have said. We'll practice building hypotheses, and then with time, we'll also practice analyzing our data that we collect to conduct our hypotheses. to test our null hypothesis. So have confidence that by the end of this semester, you'll feel very comfortable in doing the rest of this process in the spring. We're really going to focus on some of the harder concepts because anybody can write a lit review. You've been writing lit reviews. You didn't know it, but you've been writing lit reviews for multiple classes already. We want to make sure that you can build a sociological topic and a sociological question. You can frame a hypothesis, and depending on what kind of research you want to do, you can test those hypotheses and disprove or prove your null hypothesis. That's it for our hypothesis lecture for now. There's a lot of important details in this one. I want to make sure that you take good notes on this one, and make sure also in the assignments you're now going to be working on, look for those on Blackboard, where you get to kind of basically build some hypotheses and start the first little bits of what research might look like. Take some time on those. Make sure you feel comfortable with them. If you have questions, you can always contact me on office hours. You can email me with questions. We can set up appointments other time to meet via Zoom, but we can chat about this research process so that you feel comfortable with it. Pay really close attention to your hypotheses because we're going to use these all semester, and I want to make sure that by the end of the semester, you're an all-star at building a hypothesis. If you have questions or concerns in the meantime, you know where to find me. I'll see you all next time in our next lecture. See ya. Bye.